My name is Lillian, and I'm 61 years old. I never imagined I'd be sitting here speaking to you through a camera, pouring out my heart to people I've never met. But there's a story inside me, heavy and sharp, that needs to be told. It's not just my story, it's for anyone who's ever felt invisible, cast aside by the very people they loved most. It begins with a moment that cut deeper than any knife. A moment that made me question everything I thought I knew about family loyalty and my own worth. It was the day my daughter-in-law Sarah held up the gift I'd spent months crafting with my own hands and sneered this cheap trash in front of a room full of strangers. That was the day I realized I'd become a shadow in my own family, a ghost they barely noticed. I grew up in a small Ohio town in a house where love was woven into the smallest acts. My mother taught me to quilt when I was barely tall enough to reach the pedal of her old sewing machine. Her hands, rough from years of work, guided mine over scraps of fabric, each one a story. There was the faded blue from my grandfather's work shirt, the soft yellow from my aunt's wedding dress, the tiny patch from my own baby blanket. Quilting was more than a skill. It was a way to hold on to love, to stitch memories into something tangible. I carried that gift with me when I married Robert at 19. He was my anchor, a man whose quiet strength made every day feel safe. Together we built a life in a modest house with a big backyard where our son David grew up. David was my heart from the moment I held him, his tiny fingers curling around mine. Robert worked long hours as a mechanic, and I stayed home pouring myself into raising David, making our house a place of warmth, where every birthday, every Christmas was a memory to cherish. When Robert died 10 years ago, part of me died too. Cancer doesn't care about the life you've planned or the love you've nurtured. I was 51, and the world felt hollow. The house was too quiet, the bed too cold. David was grown married to Sarah with a daughter, Emily, who's 8 now and the light of my life. I thought I'd find purpose in being a grandmother, in being there for David the way I'd always been. But after Robert's death, things shifted. David's calls became rare. His visits rushed. Sarah, who'd once been warm, started treating me like an inconvenience, someone to manage rather than love. I told myself it was just life. Children grow up, they build their own families. But deep down, I felt myself fading like an old photograph left in the sun. The quilt was my way of reaching out, of reminding them I was still here, still capable of giving. Sarah's 35th birthday was approaching, and I wanted to make it special. She loved expensive things, designer handbags, perfumes I couldn't pronounce, luxuries, far beyond my widow's pension. But I had my hands, my mother's lessons, and a heart full of hope. For 3 months I worked on that quilt. I chose every piece with care. A square from Robert's favorite flannel shirt, still faintly smelling of his cologne. A strip from David's baby blanket, soft and worn. A piece from my own wedding dress. Ivory silk I'd saved for decades. Every stitch was a memory, a prayer for Sarah to feel my love, to see me as more than just David's mom. I worked late into the night, my fingers stiff, my eyes burning under the glow of my sewing lamp. When it was finished, I folded it carefully, wrapped it in tissue paper, and tied it with a ribbon. It wasn't just a gift, it was a piece of my soul. The party was at David and Sarah's house, a grand place they'd bought a few years ago. I'd helped with the down payment, dipping into the savings Robert and I had scrimped for over years. It was a gift, though they never called it that, just Mom's help, as if it was my duty. The house buzzed with Sarah's friends, people I didn't know, all sleek and loud, their laughter sharp as glass. I felt out of place in my simple navy dress, my gray hair pinned back, my hands rough from years of work. Emily ran to me, her small arms wrapping around my waist, and for a moment I felt grounded. But then Sarah called everyone to the living room for gifts, and my stomach knotted. I handed her the quilt, my hands trembling, my smile fragile but hopeful. She ripped the tissue paper away, her manicured nails glinting, and held up the quilt. For a fleeting second, I thought I saw her pause, her eyes tracing the stitches. Then she laughed, a cold, piercing sound that stopped the room. "This cheap trash," she said, tossing it onto the couch like it was garbage. "What am I supposed to do with this? Lillian, did you dig it out of a thrift store?" The room exploded in laughter, some awkward, some cruel. I stood frozen, my face hot, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might break. David was across the room scrolling on his phone, not even looking up. Emily tugged at my hand, her voice small. "Grandma, it's so pretty." But her words were lost in the noise. I mumbled something about needing air and fled, tears blurring my vision as I drove home. That night, I sat in my dark living room, the quilt still in my car, crumpled where I'd thrown it. I felt like I'd been gutted not just by Sarah's words, but by David's silence, by the way everyone laughed, as if I was nothing. I'd given my life to my family, my time, my love, my savings, and this was what I'd become. A punchline, an old woman who didn't belong. I cried until my voice was hoarse, until my eyes were dry. But in that raw, aching silence, a memory stirred. Robert sitting across from me at our kitchen table, his calloused hand over mine saying, "Lillian, you're tougher than you know. Don't ever let anyone dim your light." I didn't feel tough then, but his words were a spark. Faint, but alive, buried in the ashes of my grief. The next morning I woke with a clarity that startled me. I went to my desk, pulled out the box where I kept important papers, and found the title to the car. It was a black Audi, sleek and shining, a gift I'd given Sarah for her 33rd birthday. She'd squealed when she saw it, thrown her arms around me in front of everyone, called me the best mother-in-law ever. But the title was still in my name. I'd meant to transfer it, but life got busy and Sarah never asked. I stared at that document, my pulse quickening. That car wasn't just a gift. It was a symbol of everything I'd given, everything they'd taken, without gratitude. I thought of Sarah's sneer, David's indifference, the laughter that still echoed in my ears. And then I made a choice. I called a tow company, gave them David and Sarah's address, and drove to their street. I parked across the road, watching as the tow truck hooked up the Audi and pulled it away. My hands shook as I walked to their doorstep and slipped a note under the mat, written in my neat, cursive, "Hope you enjoy walking." I didn't feel joy, not yet. I felt exposed, like I'd torn open a wound to let it heal. But as I drove home, the quilt on the seat beside me, I felt something new, a flicker of defiance. A glimpse of the woman I'd been before grief and neglect wore me down. I didn't know what would come next, but for the first time in years, I wasn't afraid to find out. The days after I took back the car were quiet, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that soothes. It was heavy, like the air before a storm, thick with the weight of what I'd done and what might come next. I didn't tell anyone, not even my oldest friend Clara, who'd known me since we were girls, sneaking cookies from my mother's kitchen. I kept the quilt on my couch, folded neatly its colors, a reminder of both my love and my humiliation. Every time I looked at it, I felt a tug of shame, but also something else. Something stubborn, like a weed pushing through cracked pavement. I'd spent so long trying to please Sarah to fit into David's new life that I'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up for myself. Taking the car was my first step, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. David called the next day, his voice tight with anger. "Mom, what the hell? Sarah's car is gone. Did you do this?" I sat at my kitchen table, clutching the phone, my heart racing. I'd rehearsed what I'd say, but the words felt stuck, like they were caught in the back of my throat. "It's my car, David," I said finally, my voice steadier than I expected. "The title's in my name." I decided I needed it back. There was a long pause, and then he exploded. "You can't just do that. Sarah's stranded. She's got work. Emily's school. Do you know how embarrassing this is? Embarrassing." That word hit me like a slap, conjuring the memory of Sarah's laughter, the room full of strangers mocking my quilt. I wanted to scream, to ask him why my embarrassment didn't matter, why my feelings never seemed to count. But I didn't. I just said, "I'm sorry you feel that way, David," and hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, waiting for it to ring again, for him to apologize, to ask how I was. It didn't. The silence was louder than his anger, a confirmation of what I'd feared. I was no longer a priority, maybe not even a person to them. I thought of Robert, how he'd always known when I was hurting, how he'd pull me close and say, "We'll figure it out, Lil." Without him, I felt untethered like a boat, drifting too far from shore. But I couldn't stay adrift. I had to find my way back to myself, even if it meant facing the loneliness head on. That afternoon, I drove to the cemetery where Robert was buried. It was a place I hadn't visited in months, maybe because it hurt too much, maybe because I was afraid of what I'd feel. The grass was soft under my feet, the air thick with the scent of cut flowers. I knelt by his headstone, tracing his name with my fingers, and let the tears come. "I don't know if I did the right thing," I whispered, but I couldn't let them keep walking over me. I told him about the quilt, Sarah's words, David's silence. I told him how small I felt, how I was trying to be strong like he always said I was. As I spoke, a breeze stirred, rustling the leaves above me, and for a moment I swore I felt him there, his presence steady and warm. I left the cemetery with no answers, but my heart was a little lighter, like I'd left some of my grief behind. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Clara. "Lillian, it's been too long. I'm coming over tomorrow and you're not saying no. We're having tea and you're telling me what's got you so quiet." Clara was like that bossy in the best way, the kind of friend who'd show up with a casserole and a lecture if she thought you were hiding something. I smiled the first real smile in days and called her back. "Fine," I said, "but you're bringing the good cookies." She laughed, and that sound was a lifeline pulling me back to a time when I felt seen, valued, whole. Clara arrived the next morning, her silver hair pulled into a messy bun, her arms full of a tin of shortbread and a bottle of wine she swore paired perfectly with tea. We sat in my living room, the quilt between us, and I told her everything. The party, Sarah's cruelty, David's betrayal, the car, the note. She listened without interrupting, her eyes narrowing when I described Sarah's laugh, softening when I got to the part about the tow truck. When I finished, she leaned back, sipped her tea, and said, "Good for you, Lil. It's about time you reminded them who you are." I blinked, surprised. I'd expected her to scold me, to say I'd gone too far. "You don't think I was petty?" I asked. She snorted. "Petty, no. You were generous for too long, and they took it for granted. That car was yours to give and yours to take back. Let Sarah walk a mile in your shoes." Clara's words stayed with me like a song I couldn't stop humming. For so long, I'd seen myself through their eyes, an old woman, irrelevant, a burden. But Clara saw someone else, someone who'd fought for her family, who'd given everything and deserved respect. That night, I pulled out my old photo albums, the ones I hadn't touched since Robert died. I flipped through pictures of David as a boy, his gap-toothed grin as he held up a fish he'd caught. Robert and me on our wedding day, laughing as we cut the cake. My mother and me at her sewing machine, her hands steady over mine. Those memories weren't just moments, they were proof of a life I'd built, a life that mattered. I wasn't invisible. I was Lillian, and I was still here. The next week, I started making changes, small at first, but each one a step toward reclaiming myself. I called my bank and checked my savings, the account Robert and I had built over decades. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to remind me I had options. I thought about the Audi sitting in a lot across town and decided to sell it. It wasn't about the money. It was about letting go of something that tied me to Sarah's ingratitude. The sale went through quickly, and when the check came, I felt a weight lift. I didn't tell David or Sarah. I didn't owe them an explanation. I also started sewing again, not for anyone else, but for me. I made a small quilt for Emily using scraps from the same fabrics as Sarah's, but this one was brighter with a pattern of stars for my granddaughter's boundless spirit. I mailed it to her with a note. "For my favorite girl who lights up my world." I didn't know if Sarah would let her keep it, but it didn't matter. It was my way of saying I loved her no matter what. A few days later, Emily called, her voice bubbling with excitement. "Grandma, I love my quilt. I sleep with it every night." My heart swelled, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I'd done something right. But the real shift came when I ran into an old neighbor, Mrs. Carter, at the grocery store. She was 78, spry and sharp, with a habit of saying exactly what she thought. "Lillian, you look like you've got a fire in you," she said, eyeing me over her glasses. I laughed, surprised, and told her about the car, the quilt, the silence from David. She nodded like she'd heard it all before. "Families can be cruel when they forget who raised them," she said. "But you're not done yet. You've got years left to live for yourself." She invited me to her book club, a group of women my age who met every week to talk about novels, life, and everything in between. I hesitated, but she wouldn't take no for an answer. That book club became my sanctuary. The women were like me, widows, mothers, grandmothers who'd been through their own battles. They listened to my story not with pity, but with understanding. One woman, Diane, shared how her daughter had cut her off after a fight. Another, Ruth, talked about selling her house and traveling after her kids stopped visiting. Their stories weren't just sad, they were proof that we could survive, that we could find joy on the other side of pain. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. I felt like I belonged. As the weeks passed, I carried that sense of belonging with me. I wasn't the Lillian who'd left Sarah's party in tears, humiliated and broken. I was someone new, someone who'd taken back a piece of her power and wasn't giving it up again. I didn't know what David or Sarah were saying about me, and for the first time I didn't care. I was too busy living, too busy remembering who I was. But I knew one thing: the next time I saw them, I wouldn't be invisible. I'd make sure of it. The weeks that followed felt like waking up from a long, heavy sleep. I wasn't the same woman who'd driven away from Sarah's party, tears streaming down my face, the sting of her laughter burning in my chest. I was changing slowly but surely, like a tree, shaking off winter's frost. The book club. Clara's fierce support, Emily's sweet voice on the phone, they were all threads weaving me back together. But there was still a hollow place inside me, a wound that hadn't fully healed. David hadn't called since our fight, and Sarah's silence was its own kind of punishment. I'd taken back the car, but it didn't erase the years I'd spent trying to earn their love, only to be pushed aside. I wanted to be done with that pain, to let it go, but it clung to me, stubborn and sharp. One morning, as I sipped my coffee and watched the sparrows dart across my backyard, I realized something I'd been waiting for them to see me, to apologize, to make things right. But waiting was another way of giving them power, of letting them decide my worth. I couldn't keep doing that. I had to decide for myself. That thought was both terrifying and freeing, like stepping off a cliff and trusting I'd land on my feet. I didn't know exactly what it meant to live for myself, but I knew it started with small, deliberate choices. Choices that said I mattered, even if no one else agreed. I began with my house. It was the same house Robert and I had bought when David was a baby, filled with memories, but also with echoes of loss. The walls were still painted the soft yellow Robert loved, the curtains the ones I'd sewn when we moved in. But it felt like a museum preserving a life that no longer existed. I decided to make it mine again. I started small, rearranging the living room, moving the quilt from the couch to a wooden chest where it wouldn't taunt me. Then I went bigger. I painted the kitchen a bold teal, a color Robert would have teased me for, but I'd always loved. I bought new throw pillows, bright and soft, and hung a painting I'd found at a flea market. A watercolor of a woman standing alone by the sea, her face turned to the wind. Each change felt like a declaration, a way of saying, "This is my space, my life." Clara noticed the difference right away. She came over one afternoon, her arms full of daisies she'd picked from her garden, and stopped in the doorway, her eyes wide. "Lillian, this place looks alive again," she said, setting the flowers on the counter. "And so do you." I laughed a little embarrassed, but her words warmed me. We spent the afternoon drinking iced tea and talking about everything her grandkids, my book club, the time we snuck into a movie theater as teenagers, and got caught. For the first time in years, I wasn't just reminiscing about the past. I was excited about the present, about the woman I was becoming. That excitement pushed me to take another step, one I'd been avoiding: my finances. Robert and I had always been careful with money, saving what we could, living simply. After he died, I'd used some of those savings to help David and Sarah first, with their house, then with the car. I'd never regretted it, not until Sarah's cruelty made me see how little they valued it. I made an appointment with a financial advisor, a kind woman named Linda, who wore bright scarves and spoke with a no-nonsense warmth. I brought my bank statements, the sale paperwork from the Audi, and a knot of anxiety in my chest. I was afraid she'd tell me I'd been reckless, that I'd given too much away. Instead, Linda looked over my papers and smiled. "Lillian, you're in better shape than you think," she said. "The car sale was a smart move. It's liquid cash you can use for yourself, and your savings are solid. You've got options." Options. That word felt like a gift, one I hadn't expected. We talked for an hour, mapping out a plan. I'd keep enough for emergencies, but I could also invest in myself, maybe a trip, a new hobby, or even a car of my own. The idea of buying something just for me felt extravagant, almost wrong, but Linda leaned forward, her eyes steady. "You've spent your life taking care of others," she said. "It's time to take care of Lillian." That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Linda's words circling in my mind. Take care of Lillian. It sounded so simple, but it was a revolution. I thought about all the years I'd put everyone else first: Robert, David, even Sarah, in my own way. I didn't regret it. Love is sacrifice, and I'd loved fiercely. But I'd forgotten to love myself, to see myself as someone worth caring for. I fell asleep with a strange sense of possibility, like a door had cracked open, letting in light. The next day, I went to a car dealership. I hadn't planned it. I was driving by, saw the shiny rows of cars glinting in the sun, and pulled in on impulse. A young salesman named Mark approached, his smile polite but cautious, like he wasn't sure I was serious. I told him I wanted something reliable but beautiful, something that felt like me. He showed me a silver SUV, sleek and modern, with leather seats and a sunroof. I sat inside, ran my hands over the steering wheel, and imagined driving it to the book club, to Clara's, to places I hadn't been in years. "I'll take it," I said, surprising myself with how certain I sounded. Mark raised an eyebrow but didn't question me. I paid with the money from the Audi sale and a chunk of my savings, feeling a thrill I hadn't known since I was young. Driving that car home was like flying. The radio played an old song Robert and I used to dance to, and I turned it up, singing along, my voice shaky but loud. I felt powerful, not because of the car itself, but because I'd chosen it for me not to impress anyone or win their approval. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a long time, the engine off the keys, warm in my hand. I thought of Sarah, who'd loved flashing her Audi around, and David, who'd called my decision embarrassing. They didn't know about this yet, but they would. And when they did, I'd be ready. The book club became my anchor in those weeks, a place where I could be myself without apology. We were reading a novel about a woman who'd lost her husband and found herself again, and the discussions cut deep. One night, Diane, the woman whose daughter had cut her off, shared a story about buying herself a sapphire ring after years of feeling unworthy. "It's not about the money," she said, holding up her hand, the stone catching the light. "It's about saying, I'm still here and I'm enough." I nodded, thinking of my new car, the teal kitchen, the quilt I'd made for Emily. I was starting to understand. Emily was the one bright spot in my family, the one who never made me feel small. She called me every few days, her voice full of stories about school, her friends, the quilt she kept on her bed. One afternoon, she asked if she could visit just the two of us. My heart leapt, but I hesitated, knowing Sarah might not allow it. "Let me talk to your mom," I said, bracing myself. When Sarah answered, her voice was cold, clipped. "What do you want, Lillian?" I swallowed the hurt and kept my tone even. Emily wants to spend the day with me. I'd like to pick her up Saturday." There was a pause, then a sigh. "Fine. But don't fill her head with nonsense." I didn't argue. I just said thank you and hung up. That Saturday, Emily bounded into my house, her backpack bouncing her smile wide. We baked cookies, watched an old musical, and sat on the porch, where I taught her how to thread a needle. She was clumsy but eager, her small hands mimicking mine as we stitched a tiny heart onto a scrap of fabric. "Can I keep this, Grandma?" she asked, holding it up. "Of course," I said, kissing her forehead. "It's yours, just like you're mine." Dropping her off that evening was hard, but I held on to the memory of her laugh, the way she'd hugged me tight before running inside. Those moments, Emily's visit, the book club, my new car, were building something inside me, something solid and unshakable. I wasn't just surviving, I was growing. I didn't know when I'd see David or Sarah again, but I knew one thing: I wasn't the woman they'd laughed at, the one they'd dismissed. I was Lillian, and I was ready to show them exactly who I was. The months that followed were a quiet kind of revolution. I wasn't shouting my worth from the rooftops or demanding apologies from David and Sarah. Instead, I was rebuilding myself in the small, steady ways that matter, most ways they'd never see until it was too late to dismiss me. My new car, the teal kitchen, the book club. Emily's visits, they were all pieces of a life I was claiming, back a life I'd let slip through my fingers while trying to please a family that didn't value me. But even as I grew stronger, there was a part of me that ached, a part that still hoped David would call, not to yell or accuse, but to say, "Mom, I'm sorry. I see you." That call never came, and each day without it hardened something inside me, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I started spending more time with the women from the book club, each of them a mirror reflecting parts of my own story. There was Diane, who'd bought herself that sapphire ring, Ruth, who'd sold her house and traveled to Italy alone at 70, and Margaret, who'd started a small bakery after her kids stopped visiting. They weren't just friends, they were proof that life didn't end when your family turned away. One evening, as we sat in Diane's living room sipping wine and debating the ending of our latest book, Margaret leaned over and touched my hand. "Lillian, you're different lately." She said, her eyes kind but searching. "You're standing taller, like you've remembered who you are." I blushed, unsure how to respond, but her words settled deep like a seed finding fertile soil. That night, driving home under a sky heavy with stars, I thought about what Margaret had said. "Remembered who you are." I'd spent so long being David's mom, Robert's wife, Sarah's mother-in-law, that I'd forgotten Lillian, the woman who used to dance in the kitchen with Robert, who'd once dreamed of opening a quilt shop, who'd laughed so hard she cried when Clara spilled wine on her new dress at a church picnic. That Lillian was still there, buried under years of grief and neglect, and I was determined to bring her back. Not for anyone else, but for me. I decided to take a bigger step, one that scared me as much as it thrilled me. I enrolled in a community college course on small business management. The idea had come from a late-night conversation with Clara, who'd teased me about my quilting. "You could sell those, Lil," she'd said, gesturing to the stack of quilts I'd made over the years. "People pay good money for handmade things." I'd brushed it off at first, but the idea stuck growing roots. I'd always loved quilting, not just for the memories it held, but for the act itself, the rhythm of the needle, the way colors and patterns came together to tell a story. Maybe I could turn that love into something more, something that was mine. The first day of class, I felt like an imposter. The room was filled with people half my age, their laptops open, their voices confident. I sat in the back, my notebook and pen, feeling outdated, my heart pounding. But the instructor, a woman named Ms. Rivera, had a warmth that put me at ease. She talked about starting small, building a vision, believing in your product. "Every business starts with a story," she said. "What's yours?" I didn't have an answer yet, but I scribbled notes, my mind racing with possibilities. By the end of the class, I felt a spark I hadn't known in years, not just hope, but purpose. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the course. I learned about marketing, budgeting, branding words that felt foreign but exciting. At home, I started sketching ideas for a quilting business, maybe an online shop where I could sell custom pieces. I dug out old quilts from my closet, spreading them across my living room, each one a chapter of my life. There was the one I'd made for David's high school graduation with patches from his old soccer jerseys. Another for Robert, with earth tones that reminded me of his love for the outdoors. I realized these weren't just blankets, they were art pieces of my heart that someone out there might cherish. The thought made me feel alive, like I was stepping into a version of myself I'd long forgotten. Clara became my unofficial cheerleader, showing up with coffee and ideas, insisting I name my business something fancy, but not too fancy. We settled on Lillian's Legacy, a name that felt right, like a promise to myself and to the women who'd come before me. My mother, my grandmother, all the hands that had taught me to stitch. I spent evenings building a simple website, fumbling with the technology, but refusing to give up. Emily helped one afternoon, her small fingers flying over my laptop as she showed me how to upload photos. "Grandma, this is so cool," she said, her eyes wide. "You're going to be famous." I laughed, pulling her into a hug, but her belief in me was a gift, one I tucked away for the days when doubt crept in. Emily's visits were my joy, but they also reminded me of the family I'd lost. Sarah allowed them, but always with an edge of control, as if she was doing me a favor. David hadn't spoken to me since our fight, and the silence was a wound I carried quietly. I wanted to reach out to tell him I missed him, but pride and a growing sense of self-respect kept me from picking up the phone. I wasn't ready to beg for his love, not when I was finally learning to love myself. One afternoon, as I was pinning fabric for a new quilt, I found a box in my attic I hadn't opened in years. Inside was Robert's old watch, a simple silver thing he'd worn every day, its face scratched, but still ticking. I held it to my ear, listening to the faint tick-tick, and felt him with me steady as ever. I slipped it onto my wrist, the weight comforting, and made a decision I'd wear it every day, not as a relic of grief, but as a reminder of the strength he'd always seen in me. That watch became my talisman, a small act of defiance against the years that had tried to make me feel small. The book club women noticed the change too. One night, Ruth pulled me aside after a meeting, her eyes sharp. "You're up to something, Lillian," she said, a smile tugging at her lips. "Spill it." I told her about the business course, the website, the quilts. She listened, nodding, then grabbed my hands. "This is it," she said. "This is you taking your life back. Don't stop." Her words were like fuel pushing me forward when the work felt overwhelming or the loneliness crept in. As my confidence grew, so did my sense of independence. I started saying no to things that drained me. Church committees I'd joined out of obligation favors for neighbors who never reciprocated. I spent my time on what mattered: my quilts, my classes, my friends, Emily. I even planned a trip, something I hadn't done since Robert was alive. It wasn't grand, just a weekend at a bed and breakfast by Lake Erie where I could walk the shore and think. Clara insisted on coming, and we laughed like schoolgirls planning our escape over wine and cheese. But beneath this new strength, I knew a reckoning was coming. David and Sarah's anniversary was in a few weeks, a big family event they hosted every year. I hadn't been invited since the car incident, but Emily mentioned it during a visit, her eyes hopeful. "Will you come, Grandma?" she asked. I hesitated, picturing Sarah's cold stare, David's indifference. But then I thought of my new car, my quilts, the watch on my wrist. I wasn't the woman they'd mocked, and I wouldn't hide from them. "I'll be there, sweetheart," I said, kissing her forehead. I didn't know what would happen, but I knew I'd walk in with my head high, ready to face whatever came. That night, I sat at my sewing machine working on a quilt for the anniversary, a gift not for Sarah or David, but for Emily to mark the family we still had. As the needle hummed, I felt a quiet power growing inside me, a certainty that I was no longer invisible. I was Lillian, and I was ready to show them all. 2. The anticipation of David and Sarah's anniversary party hung over me like a storm cloud, both daunting and strangely exhilarating. I hadn't seen them in months, not since the car, not since I'd started stitching my life back together with quilts classes and the fierce support of my book club sisters. The old Lillian would have dreaded the event, would have spent days agonizing over what to wear, what to say, how to avoid Sarah's sharp tongue or David's cold silence. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was someone new, someone who'd learned to stand tall even when the ground felt unsteady. Still, as I ironed my dress, a deep emerald green that made me feel bold, and slipped Robert's watch onto my wrist, I couldn't shake the flutter of nerves in my chest. This wasn't just a party. It was a moment of truth, a chance to show them I wasn't the invisible old woman they'd laughed at. I'd spent the weeks leading up to the event pouring myself into my quilting, not just for Emily's gift, but for my fledgling business. Lillian's legacy was starting to take shape piece by piece, like one of my quilts. The website was live with photos of my work, each quilt a story of love loss or resilience. I'd sold my first piece, a small lap quilt with a pattern of interlocking hearts, to a woman in the book club who'd insisted on paying full price. "This isn't just fabric," she'd said, running her hands over the stitches. "It's you, Lillian." That sale, small as it was, felt like a victory proof that my hands could still create something valuable, something the world wanted. It gave me courage not just for my business, but for the confrontation I knew was coming. Emily's quilt was my masterpiece, a labor of love that took every ounce of my skill. I'd chosen fabrics that spoke to her spirit, bright blues for her endless curiosity, soft pinks for her gentle heart, a splash of gold for the way she lit up my world. The pattern was a starburst radiating from the center, each point a reminder that she was the brightest part of my family, the one who never made me feel small. I stitched a tiny heart in the corner with her initials, and mine a secret bond between us. When it was done, I wrapped it in tissue paper, tied it with a ribbon, and wrote a note. "For Emily, my star. Always shine, no matter what." I didn't care if Sarah scoffed or David ignored it. This was for my granddaughter, and no one could take that away. The morning of the party, Clara came over, her eyes sparkling with mischief. "You're gonna knock 'em dead, Lil," she said, adjusting my necklace, a simple pearl Robert had given me on our 10th anniversary. "Walk in there like you own the place." I laughed, but her confidence was contagious. We sipped coffee and strategized not about revenge, but about presence, how to carry myself, how to let my strength speak without saying a word. "Don't let Sarah get under your skin," Clara warned. "She'll try, but you're bigger than her now." I nodded, feeling the weight of Robert's watch, the emerald dress, the quilt in my car. I was ready. The drive to David and Sarah's house was a blur, my hands tight on the wheel of my new silver SUV. The car felt like an extension of me, sleek and strong, a far cry from the old sedan I'd driven for years. As I pulled into their neighborhood, I saw the familiar sprawl of their house, the one I'd helped them buy, the one where Sarah had tossed my quilt like garbage. My stomach twisted, but I took a deep breath, picturing Emily's smile, Clara's fierce nod, the book club women cheering me on. I parked, grabbed the quilt, and walked to the door, my heels clicking on the pavement, my heart steady. The party was in full swing when I arrived, the house buzzing with voices, music, and the clink of glasses. Sarah's friends were there, the same polished crowd from her birthday, their laughter sharp and familiar. I spotted David across the room talking to a man I didn't know, his face relaxed in a way it never was with me. Sarah was near the kitchen, her dress a shimmering red, her smile bright but brittle. Emily saw me first, running over with a squeal, her arms wrapping around my waist. "Grandma, you're here," she said, her joy cutting through the noise. I hugged her tight, feeling every eye in the room turn to me, whispers rippling like a breeze. Sarah approached, her smile tight, her eyes cold. "Lillian," she said, her voice clipped. "I didn't expect you." I met her gaze, my own steady. "Emily invited me. I said simply, handing her the quilt. "This is for her." Sarah's lips twitched like she wanted to say something sharp, but she took the package and set it on a table unopened. David joined us, his expression unreadable. "Mom," he said, nodding, no warmth in his voice. I nodded back, refusing to shrink. "Happy anniversary." I said, my tone calm but firm. I could feel the weight of their judgment, the unspoken tension from the car, the quilt, the months of silence. But I stood tall, my emerald dress catching the light, Robert's watch glinting on my wrist. The evening unfolded in a haze of small talk and forced smiles. I mingled not because I wanted to impress anyone, but because I refused to hide. I talked to Emily about her school play, laughed with an older couple who admired my dress, even shared a polite word with one of Sarah's friends, who seemed surprised I wasn't the frail old woman she'd expected. But the real moment came later, when Sarah called everyone to the backyard for a toast. The guests gathered on the lawn, the air warm with summer fairy lights twinkling above. I stayed near the edge, Emily at my side, her hand in mine. Sarah raised her glass, her voice carrying over the crowd. To family, she said, her eyes flicking to David, then to the guests, carefully avoiding me. To the people who make this life worth living. The words were pretty, but they felt hollow, a performance for her audience. I felt a pang not just for myself, but for the family we'd once been the one I'd poured my heart into. Then David spoke, his voice softer, less rehearsed. And to those who've supported us, he said, his gaze landing on me for the briefest moment. We wouldn't be here without them. My breath caught, unsure if it was an olive branch or an accident. I didn't have time to decide. Emily tugged at my hand, whispering, "Grandma, can I open my gift?" Now I nodded, leading her to the table where Sarah had left the quilt. The crowd was still focused on the toast, but a few heads turned as Emily tore into the tissue paper, her gasp loud in the quiet. "It's so beautiful," she said, holding up the starburst quilt, its colors glowing under the lights. She wrapped it around her shoulders, spinning in a circle, her laughter pure and bright. A few guests murmured their eyes on the quilt, then on me. I felt exposed, but not in the way I had at Sarah's birthday. This was different, proud, vulnerable, real. Sarah walked over her face, a mask of politeness, but I saw the flicker of irritation in her eyes. "Another quilt, Lillian," she said, her voice low, meant for me alone. "Haven't we done this before?" The jab was sharp, meant to wound, but I didn't flinch. "This one's for Emily," I said, my voice steady. "It's not about you." Her smile faltered just for a second, and I saw something new in her eyes, not just disdain, but unease. She didn't know this. Lillian, the one who didn't cower, who didn't beg for approval. David joined us, his brow furrowed, but before he could speak, Emily hugged me again, the quilt still around her. "I love it, Grandma," she said. "It's the best present ever." That moment was a turning point, though I didn't know it yet. I'd come to the party expecting a battle, ready to defend myself against Sarah's cruelty or David's indifference. But what I found was something else, a chance to show them and myself that I was more than their judgments. As the night wound down, I drove home, Emily's laughter echoing in my mind, the weight of the quilt's success settling in my chest. I wasn't done proving myself not to them, but to me. And I knew the next step would be bigger, bolder, a statement they couldn't ignore. The anniversary party left me with a quiet fire in my chest, a certainty that I was no longer the woman who'd fled Sarah's birthday, in tears, her laughter ringing in my ears. Emily's joy over the quilt, Sarah's fleeting unease, even David's brief glance during his toast, they were small moments, but they felt like victories, proof that I could stand in their world and not be diminished. Yet as I drove home that night, the stars bright above, and Robert's watch, heavy on my wrist, I knew I wasn't done. The quilt, the car, the business course, they were steps, but I needed more. Not to prove anything to Sarah or David, but to honor the woman I was becoming, the one who'd been buried under years of giving too much and asking for too little. The next morning I woke early, the house still and soft with dawn. I made coffee and sat at my sewing table, where a new quilt lay half-finished its pattern, a swirl of blues and greens like the lake I'd visited with Clara. As I threaded my needle, I thought about Lillian's legacy, my little business that was starting to feel less like a dream and more like a reality. The website had gotten a few more orders, mostly from book club friends and their networks, but each one felt like a milestone. I wasn't just selling quilts. I was sharing pieces of myself, stories stitched into fabric that someone somewhere would hold close. That thought gave me courage, but it also brought a new question. How far could I take this? Could I make it more than a hobby, something that wasn't just mine but lasting? I decided to push myself further. My business course was wrapping up, and Ms. Rivera had assigned a final project, a detailed plan for launching a small business. Most of my classmates were younger. Their ideas, flashy apps, tech startups, trendy cafes. I felt out of place, but I poured myself into my plan for Lillian's legacy. I wrote about custom quilts, each one unique, marketed not just as blankets, but as heirlooms gifts that carried meaning. I researched online platforms, local craft fairs, even the possibility of teaching quilting workshops. The numbers were daunting supplies shipping advertising, but Linda, my financial advisor, had shown me I had enough to start small to take the risk. I stayed up late, my kitchen table covered in notes and fabric swatches, Robert's watch ticking beside me, a reminder that time was mine to use. Clara was my sounding board, showing up with her usual mix of encouragement and tough love. "You're not just making quilts, Lil," she said one evening, flipping through my business plan. "You're building a legacy, just like the name says. Don't play small." Her words stuck, pushing me to think bigger. I reached out to a local craft shop, a cozy place run by a woman named Beth, who'd heard about my quilts through a book club friend. Beth was warm but direct, asking to see my work before agreeing to stock anything. I brought her 3 quilts, including the one I'd made for Emily, and watched as she ran her hands over the stitches, her eyes softening. "These are special." "Lillian," she said. "I'll take them all, and I want you to do a workshop here next month." I left the shop dizzy with pride, my heart full in a way I hadn't felt since Robert was alive. The workshop was a leap, but I said yes, fueled by Beth's belief and Clara's insistence that I was ready. I spent weeks preparing, designing a simple project for beginners, practicing my instructions until I could say them without stumbling. The day of the workshop, I stood in the shop's back room, surrounded by 10 women of all ages, their faces curious, some skeptical. My hands shook as I introduced myself, but as I started talking about quilting, its history, its power to hold memories, my nerves melted away. I showed them the quilt I'd made for my mother years ago and told its story, how each patch came from her life, how it had comforted her in her final days. The room was quiet, their eyes on me, and for the first time I felt like I wasn't just Lillian, the widow, the grandmother, the mother-in-law. I was Lillian, the artist, the teacher, the woman with something to give. The workshop was a success, not because everyone's stitches were perfect, but because the women left smiling, clutching their small quilt squares, promising to come back. Beth sold 2 of my quilts that week, and I got an email from a customer who'd bought one online saying she'd cried when she read the story I'd included with it. Those moments weren't just about money, they were about connection, about knowing my work mattered. I started to see Lillian's legacy as more than a business. It was a way to leave a mark, to say I'd been here, that I'd lived and loved and fought to be seen. But even as my world expanded, the silence from David and Sarah grew heavier. Emily's visits were my lifeline, but they were carefully controlled by Sarah, who never spoke to me directly, just sent curt texts about pickup times. I knew they were still angry about the car, maybe even about the quilt at the anniversary party, but their refusal to talk felt like a wall I couldn't climb. One evening, as I was sewing, Emily called, her voice quieter than usual. "Grandma." "Why doesn't Mom like you?" she asked. The question hit like a punch, and I struggled to find an answer that wouldn't hurt her. "Sometimes grown-ups don't understand each other," I said finally, "but I love you and that's what matters." She seemed satisfied, but her question lingered a reminder that my fight for myself wasn't just about me, it was about showing Emily what it meant to be strong. I decided to do something symbolic, not for Sarah or David, but for myself. I'd been carrying the pain of Sarah's birthday party, the memory of her tossing my quilt like trash. I couldn't undo that moment, but I could reclaim it. I took the quilt, the one she'd mocked, and spread it across my dining table. It was beautiful despite her words, its patches holding pieces of Robert David me. I decided to finish it, not as a gift, but as a piece for my shop, a statement of my resilience. I added new patches of scrap from Clara's old apron, a piece from Emily's favorite dress, a strip of teal fabric from my kitchen. Each stitch was a release, a way of letting go of the shame and claiming the love I'd poured into it. When it was done, I hung it on my wall, a reminder that their rejection didn't define me. The book club women were my cheerleaders, celebrating every step. Diane came to the workshop, her sapphire ring flashing as she clapped at the end. Ruth sent me a postcard from her latest trip with a note, "Keep shining, Lillian. You're unstoppable." Margaret invited me to her bakery where we ate warm scones and talked about dreams we'd let go and ones we were still chasing. Their support wasn't just kindness, it was a mirror showing me a woman who was growing, not shrinking. I started to believe in her, to trust that I could face whatever came next. That next moment was closer than I thought. A few days before my business course ended, I got a text from David, the first in months. "Mom, we need to talk. Can you come over this weekend?" My heart leapt, then sank, unsure what he wanted. Was it an apology, a confrontation, or something else? I stared at the message, my thumb hovering over the reply. Part of me wanted to say no to protect the peace I'd built, but another part, the part that still loved my son, despite everything, knew I had to go. I typed back, "I'll be there," and felt a mix of dread and determination. Whatever he wanted, I wouldn't walk in as the old Lillian, the one who begged for scraps of love. I'd walk in as myself, whole and unafraid. As I prepared for the meeting, I worked on one last quilt, not for sale, but for me. It was simple, with a single patch from each person who'd shaped me: Robert's flannel, David's baby blanket, Emily's dress, Clara's apron, my mother's apron. It was a map of my life, a reminder of where I'd been and where I was going. I didn't know what David would say or how Sarah would react, but I knew one thing: I was ready. I was Lillian, and I was enough. The day of my meeting with David arrived like a wave I'd seen coming, but still wasn't fully prepared for. I woke with a knot in my stomach, the kind that comes from knowing something big is about to happen, even if you can't predict what. I stood at my kitchen counter, sipping coffee, staring at the quilt I'd hung on the wall, the one Sarah had mocked, now transformed with new patches, a symbol of my refusal to be broken. Robert's watch ticked on my wrist, steady as his love had been, and I felt him with me whispering, "You've got this, Lil." I chose my outfit carefully, a tailored blouse and deep blue slacks that made me feel strong, and the pearl necklace from our 10th anniversary. This wasn't about impressing David or Sarah. It was about honoring myself, walking into their world as the woman I'd become. I drove to their house in my silver SUV, the radio off, the silence filled with my own thoughts. I'd spent months building Lillian's legacy teaching workshops, selling quilts, finding joy in the book club and Emily's visits. Those things had given me a foundation, a sense of worth that didn't depend on my son's approval or Sarah's cruelty. But this meeting was different. David's text, "We need to talk," had been vague, and I braced myself for anything: anger about the car, resentment over the anniversary party, or maybe a crack in the wall between us. Whatever it was, I promised myself I wouldn't shrink, wouldn't let their words cut me down again. When I pulled into their driveway, the house looked the same, grand, polished, a monument to the life I'd helped them build. My heart twinged, remembering the check I'd written for their down payment, the savings Robert and I had scraped together. I'd never asked for thanks, but I'd hoped for respect, and that hope had been shattered at Sarah's birthday. I grabbed my purse, took a deep breath, and walked to the door. Emily answered, her face lighting up. "Grandma," she cried, throwing her arms around me. I hugged her tight, her warmth grounding me. "Is your mom or dad here?" I asked, and she nodded, pointing to the living room. David was there, sitting on the couch, his hands clasped his face, tense. Sarah stood by the window, her arms crossed her expression, a mix of irritation and something I couldn't quite read. Nervousness, maybe. The air was thick, like the moment before thunder. "Mom," David said, standing as I entered. "Thanks for coming." His voice was neutral, but there was a strain in it, like he was holding something back. I nodded, taking a seat. My posture straight, my eyes meeting his. "What's this about David?" I asked, keeping my tone calm but firm. He hesitated, glancing at Sarah, who didn't move. "We've been talking," he said finally. "About the car, the party, everything. It's been tense. Tense." The word felt like a dodge, too small for the pain they'd caused. I waited, letting the silence stretch, refusing to fill it with apologies or excuses. Sarah spoke next, her voice sharp but less confident than usual. "You embarrassed us, Lillian. Taking the car like that, showing up at our anniversary with that quilt, it's like you're trying to make a point." I felt a flash of anger, hot and sharp, but I kept my face steady. "I wasn't trying to make a point," I said. "I was protecting myself. You mocked my gift, Sarah. You humiliated me in front of your friends. And David, you stood there and let it happen." David flinched, his eyes dropping to the floor. Sarah's lips tightened, but she didn't interrupt. I went on, my voice low but unwavering. "That car was mine, legally and morally. I gave it to you out of love, but love isn't a blank check for disrespect. I took it back because I deserved better." The room was silent, Emily's soft breathing the only sound. I felt exposed but not weak, raw but powerful. David ran a hand through his hair, his face conflicted. "I didn't know it hurt you that much," he said quietly. "I should have said something at the party. I'm sorry, Mom." His apology caught me off guard, a crack in the armor I'd built. I wanted to believe it, to let it heal the ache in my chest, but I'd learned to guard my heart. "Thank you," I said, my voice softer, but still steady. "But an apology doesn't erase everything. I've spent years feeling like I don't matter to you, like I'm a burden. That's not how family should feel." Sarah shifted, her eyes flashing. "You're not perfect either, Lillian. You can't just take things back and expect us to be okay with it." I met her gaze, unflinching. "And you can't treat me like I'm nothing and expect me to keep giving." The tension broke when Emily ran in, holding the starburst quilt I'd given her. "Grandma, can you show me how to fix this?" she asked, pointing to a loose stitch. Her innocence cut through the heaviness, and I smiled, patting the couch beside me. As I threaded a needle and showed her how to mend it, I felt David and Sarah watching, their silence different now, less hostile, more uncertain. When Emily hugged me, whispering, "You're the best I saw," Sarah's face softened just for a moment before she looked away. David cleared his throat. "There's something else," he said, his voice hesitant. "We're struggling, Mom. The house payments, Emily's school, it's a lot. I know we messed up, but we need help." My heart sank, not because of the request, but because of what it meant. They hadn't called to reconcile. They'd called because they needed something. I took a breath, steadying myself. "I've helped you before," I said. "The house, the car, those were gifts, and you know how they were treated. I can't keep pouring myself into a well that doesn't hold water." Sarah's face reddened, but David held up a hand. "I get it," he said. I didn't know how to fix this." I looked at him, my son, the boy I'd raised, and felt a mix of love and grief. "Fixing it starts with respect," I said. "Not just for me, but for what I've given you. I'm not a bank, David. I'm your mother." He nodded, his eyes wet, and for the first time I saw a glimpse of the boy who'd once clung to me, who'd needed me in a way that wasn't about money. I stood smoothing my blouse, ready to leave. But before I did, I turned to Sarah. "One more thing," I said, my voice calm but deliberate. The car I took back. It was an Audi Q7 fully paid for, worth over $60,000. I sold it and bought myself something better. Her eyes widened and I saw the realization hit, how much I'd given, how little she'd valued it. I didn't wait for a response. I hugged Emily, kissed her forehead, and walked out, my head high, the click of my heels echoing in the quiet. When I got to my car, I sat for a moment, the weight of the conversation settling. I'd expected a fight, maybe even hoped for reconciliation. But what I got was something else: clarity. They'd seen me not as the old woman they'd dismissed, but as someone with power, someone who wouldn't be taken for granted. I drove home, the road stretching out like a promise, and felt a quiet pride. I'd stood my ground, not with anger, but with dignity, and that was enough. The next week, I threw myself back into Lillian's legacy. The workshop had sparked interest, and Beth asked me to do another, this time with a local women's group. I sold 3 more quilts, each one a piece of my story, and started planning a booth at a regional craft fair. The book club, women celebrated with me, Diane bringing champagne, Ruth toasting to Lillian, the unstoppable. Clara, ever practical, helped me pack quilts for the fair, her laughter filling my house. Emily called, her voice bright, saying she'd shown her quilt to her class, and I felt a warmth that no fight with David or Sarah could dim. I didn't know if David would reach out again or if Sarah would ever soften, but I realized it didn't matter as much as it once had. I'd built a life that was mine: quilts, friends, a business, a granddaughter's love. I was no longer waiting for their approval. I was Lillian, and I was whole. The weeks after my confrontation with David and Sarah felt like the calm after a storm. The air was clearer, my heart lighter, not because everything was resolved, but because I'd finally claimed my place in my own story. I'd walked into their house, spoken my truth, and left with my dignity intact. The weight of their expectations no longer crushing me. Sarah's stunned silence when I revealed the Audi's value. David's halting apology. They were moments I'd carry not as trophies, but as markers of how far I'd come. I wasn't the Lillian who'd cried herself to sleep after Sarah's birthday, who'd felt invisible in her own family. I was someone new, someone who'd built a life from the ashes of neglect, and I was at peace with that. My days settled into a rhythm that felt both purposeful and joyful. Lillian's legacy was growing slowly but steadily, like a garden I'd tended with care. The craft fair was a success. 3 quilts sold, a dozen orders placed, and a handful of new customers who wanted custom pieces. Beth from the craft shop became a partner of sorts, offering me space for more workshops and a corner of her store for a permanent display. Each sale, each workshop, each email from a customer who'd been moved by my work added to the foundation I was building. I wasn't just making quilts. I was creating a legacy, just as Clara had said, one that would outlast me, that would say I'd been here, that I'd mattered. Emily remained my brightest light. Her visits were more frequent now, Sarah's control loosening, perhaps because she sensed I wouldn't bend to her anymore. Emily and I spent afternoons sewing, baking, or just talking her stories about school and friends, filling my house with life. One day she brought a drawing. She'd made a picture of us under a big, colorful quilt, our hands linked, smiles wide. "This is us, Grandma," she said, taping it to my fridge. "We're a team." I hugged her, my throat tight, and realized she was my true family, the one who saw me without conditions. I vowed to be there for her, not just as a grandmother, but as a model of strength, showing her what it meant to stand tall. The book club women were my anchors, their laughter and wisdom a constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Diane invited me to her daughter's art show, a tentative step toward reconciliation that made me hope for my own with David. Ruth sent postcards from her latest trip, this time to Greece. Her handwriting, bold, "Live Big Lillian Margaret's Bakery," became our unofficial meeting spot where we'd sip coffee and talk about books, dreams, and the lives we were still building. Clara Ever My Rock pushed me to keep going, showing up with fabric swatches or a bottle of wine, her voice firm. "You're not done yet, Lil. Not by a long shot." Their support wasn't just friendship. It was a lifeline, a reminder that family could be chosen, not just born. David and I hadn't spoken since our meeting, but I felt a shift in him, subtle but real. He sent a text a week later, short but softer. "Thanks for coming, Mom. I'm thinking about what you said." I didn't reply right away, not out of anger, but because I needed to sit with it to let his words settle without rushing to fix things. When I did respond, I kept it simple. "I'm here, David. When you're ready." I didn't know if he'd ever be ready, if he'd ever fully see the pain he'd caused, but I was okay with that uncertainty. My peace didn't depend on him anymore. Sarah, too, was a question mark, her silence louder than words. I didn't expect an apology, and I didn't need one. I'd moved beyond her reach, her cruelty no longer a blade that could cut me. One evening, as autumn painted the trees gold and red, I decided to do something I'd been thinking about for weeks. I went to my backyard where a small patch of earth lay bare, a spot Robert had once planned to turn into a garden. I'd neglected it since his death, letting weeds take over, but now I saw it differently, a place for new beginnings. I bought a sapling, a young maple with delicate leaves, and spent an afternoon digging, planting, and watering it. As I patted the soil, I thought of my mother who'd taught me to quilt, and Robert who'd taught me to love, and Emily who'd taught me to hope. The tree was for them, but also for me, a symbol of growth of roots that would hold strong no matter what storms came. I invited Emily over the next day, wanting to share the moment with her. We stood by the sapling, her small hand in mine, and I gave her something else, a tiny quilted pouch I'd made filled with patches from our family, Robert's flannel, her mother's old scarf, my wedding dress. "This is for you," I said, kneeling to meet her eyes. "It's a piece of us to carry with you always. No matter what happens, you're part of my legacy, and I'm part of yours." She hugged me the pouch, clutched tight, and whispered, "I love you, Grandma." Those words were a balm healing wounds I'd carried too long. As winter approached, I kept building. I planned a new workshop series this time for mothers and daughters, a way to share the love of quilting across generations. I expanded my website, adding a blog where I wrote about the stories behind my quilts, not just mine, but those of the women who'd inspired me, like my mother, Clara, and the book club. I even started saving for a trip maybe to Italy, where Ruth had promised to show me the best gelato spots. My life was full, not with grand gestures, but with quiet, meaningful moments that added up to something beautiful. One morning, as I sipped tea and watched the snow dust my backyard, I thought about forgiveness. I didn't hate David or Sarah, not anymore. I felt a kind of pity for them, for the way they'd let entitlement and pride blind them to what mattered. I wasn't sure I'd ever fully forgive them, not in the way that erases pain, but I could let go of the anger, let it drift away, like leaves on the wind. I was at peace, not because they'd changed, but because I had. I'd found my worth not in their eyes, but in my own, in the quilts. I made the tree I'd planted the love I gave to Emily and myself. I sat at my sewing table that evening working on a new quilt, this one, for no one but me. It was bold with patches of every color I loved, teal, gold, deep red, a celebration of the life I'd reclaimed. As the needle moved, I felt a quiet joy, a wholeness that didn't need validation. I thought of all the women watching this video, the ones who'd felt discarded, disrespected, unseen. I wanted them to know what I'd learned, what had carried me through. So I'll end with this. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. Plant your tree stitch, your story, live your truth. You are enough. I stood taking the quilted pouch I'd given Emily and placing it on my shelf next to Robert's watch and a photo of us dancing at our wedding. Then I walked to the backyard, lit a small candle, and set it by the maple sapling its flame, steady in the winter air. It was a gesture not for anyone else but for me, a light to guide me forward, a promise to keep living, keep loving, keep being Lillian.